Welcome to another episode of Distory. My name is Kirk from walruscarp.com, and this evening we are going back to Disneyland to celebrate the wonderful and wild ride of Mr. Toad. This evening we are going to be upgrading from the 60s and heading to 1983's new Fantasyland project and the refurb and updates, particularly to the outside facade and the beginning parts of the queue. So we'll see how far we get tonight as to whether we get on this wild ride or not. But with me to dive on this amazing experience is the one, the only, the well-authored, well-read, well-researched Kate, the Disney Cicerone. Kate, how we doing this evening?
I'm so excited for this episode. There's some weird rabbit trails that I went down that I can't wait to share with everybody.
I mean, it's Distory. When does it not get weird?
Yeah, exactly. So I think where we have to start now, where we left off last episode, was we talked about the 1955 version, all the way up into the time when it gets closed in the right before the 1980s and a remodel. And it was a lot of painted flats. It was a lot of cars banging into doors, actually physically banging into doors. It was a lot of really interesting characters, some of which show up later and some of which don't. But now we're going to go to this place where we have talked about before, where Fantasyland is crumbling. So this is this point in the 70s, and I do have this really fabulous picture to show you guys of Mr. Toad in his Toad car on the parade route in Disneyland. This is the time we're at in this 1970s. You can even see that the headlights of the cars, they did the same thing here of the cars that are in the Mr. Toad ride in the 70s. They replaced the headlights with just like these kind of orange circles. But Fantasyland is now crumbling at this point. It is being held together by particle board and paint, because you remember that they pretty much used the same technique that they used to build sets for movies for Fantasyland. Now, we went into like a deep dive of this new Fantasyland remodel in Snow White, so I don't want to get in the weeds about it too much. You can go back to listen to that episode if you're interested in a little bit more details of that. But I do know that, the day that the bulldozers came in and kind of like destroyed Fantasyland, Tony Baxter said, he looked around and said, "My God, what have we done?" Because they basically took out virtually everything that was in Walt Disney's Fantasyland. So it was a very different place at that point. If you remember, this is what Fantasyland looked like. But then they came in, they brought the bulldozers in, and then things changed. So this is what they look like when it's under construction. They really did just gut the buildings. They took out virtually everything. They saved some pieces that they could use later. I like this picture because you can see people actually like walking through the middle of Fantasyland, and the construction walls are not high. They're like these tiny little short ones, which is so different than what we have today,
Yeah, it's fun to see like scaffolding up and seeing them like working on the exteriors of these things, because remember, up until this point, it was just wooden facades that looked like a medieval tent. So it wasn't exactly austere or prestigious. So it's nice to see the change, and it's a pretty substantial one. I have a couple of things from just when they were doing the announcement for it. There's this great LA Times article I'm going to share real quick. The only reason why I want to bring this up, because I think it's kind of cool, is in this LA Times article, it talks about the new Fantasyland. But for me, the really exciting part is that there's a portion that's dedicated to Mr. Toad's Wild Ride. So we didn't really specifically talk about this section. We talked about kind of everything as a whole. And so there's some fun like little kind of snippets that happen here. But there is one part of this article. So there's one section on the right-hand side that says, "The child in all of us loves the whimsical, and that's the endearing charm of Mr. Toad's Wild Ride. Don't let the stately Tudor home of J. Thaddeus Toad fool you for a minute. You're in for a real zany fun. Walk through the beautiful formal gardens and begin your adventure by driving right through the fireplace. Soon you'll be tearing wildly through the streets of London town. Mr. Toad will get you into so much mischief that you'll land right in front of an angry judge. And as you could easily guess, there's a real surprise ending to all of the craziness." And it says, on the right-hand side, it says, "Don't be fooled by Mr. Toad's formal portrait. He'll take you on a wild ride you'll never forget." So I think that one's just a little bit something different than what we showed in the past. Now, I am going to pull one other thing because this is another just fun little construction as this was being done. We had shown this in the past. This is the Wish Upon a Brighter Star New Fantasyland coming true in 1983. Now, on the left-hand side, there's four little kind of murals for all the different photos of attractions that are coming. There's Peter Pan, there's Mr. Toad, there's Snow White, and then Pinocchio, which remember, Pinocchio is new, and they hadn't done the refurb yet to Alice in Wonderland, but Alice in Wonderland was an added attraction later on in the 50s. But we want to go up close and personal with Cyril Proudbottom.
Keep off the grass.
Yeah, and keep off the grass. This is kind of funny because Mr. Toad is like sitting in Cyril Proudbottom's hands, but then there's like a dude who's like driving the car all crazy. So I'm assuming like because the carriage is broke, my thought process is, and it does show a Tudor home in the backdrop, but my thought is that they're about to commandeer this vehicle because they're so excited, and they're no longer going to adorn themselves with carriages, and instead will go to motor cars.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. That's so fun.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. But that's not Mr. Toad driving that. It's like just a dude.
That's not Mr.
He's got a.
Are you sure?
No. Check his hands and check like his like if it is it two Mr. Toads in this picture? Like who drove through and broke it, or is that just like the fountain that they're going to be, and it's like honoring what will be there?
Well,
so, like why would somebody build a fountain for Cyril and Mr. Toad, and Mr. Toad would drive around it? You know, it's
dashing through everything. That's what happens in the ride. So I think
items in the ride.
Well, what I mean is like the mural, though, that you see in the beginning, which we'll get to as we go through the queue here, it shows Mr. Toad in multiple places. Remember, we had that in the 1955 version too. It actually says they will let it again. Right. So I think it's just for panning that.
You did see me. Okay.
Yeah.
Fair enough. You know what I think it is? It's because Cyril kind of looks like an actual character, and Mr. Toad straight up just looks like a tiny little Mr. Toad. Like how big he would actually be in real life.
Yeah, it's true. You know? He looks very small. So. Yes. So the logistics of making New Fantasyland, they did do a lot of reorganizing of this space, which we've talked about before. You know, they moved the teacups, they moved it over near the Alice in Wonderland section. They kind of built a whole Alice in Wonderland section. They took what was the Fantasyland Theater on the left-hand side, and they demolished that, and they turned it into Pinocchio area, right? And then they moved the carousel back to make more space, but also they moved the buildings, the front of the rides forward, the facades forward, so that they could make room for the queues. So people would not have to be standing out in the sun and out in the elements if it does rain. So they did the same thing with Mr. Toad facade. They pulled it forward to add more space. So you can see here, this is actual work copy from Imagineering of the existing Fantasyland. And then you see here, they changed it. And you can see they moved the teacups. The carousel is now in the center. And you can see all those different additions there. And they tell you this is the phase 2 projects that they worked on for it, essentially. So, and then if you see here, this is them building out that facade, which we'll get to the whole building in a second. But this is some construction photos of what it looked like while they were constructing this. The other thing they did was they moved the Mad Hatter shop that used to be on the side that was closest to the hot place in Mr. Toad. That was where the Mad Hatter hat shop used to be. And they actually relocated that to the other side, which where we know it today is inside that cute little cottage and whatnot. So that was a big change that they made as well for Mr. Toad's Wild Ride. So I do have a description from Disneyland's Inside Story from 1987. I actually have this book. And it said, in a way, the new Fantasyland forged a symbolic link between the pioneers and inheritors of the Disneyland tradition. The team included Ken Anderson, the first Disney employee to ever work on Disneyland, and Tony Baxter, who as a child had vicariously lived every legend Anderson had helped create. With Anderson and Baxter's help, the Disney classic animated films took a giant step toward becoming a new and improved three-dimensional reality. The dark rides of the new Fantasyland explore the frightening world of Snow White, the escapism to Neverland by the child in all of us called Peter Pan, the moralistic fable of Pinocchio, the madcap cacophonous fun of Mr. Toad, and a short time later, the nonsensical world of Alice in Wonderland. All the shows featured state-of-the-art effects, and for the first time in Fantasyland, audio-animatronic figures. So they highlighted the fact that they added audio-animatronic figures to Fantasyland, which they had not had up until this point. So big step forward there for Imagineering.
Yeah, we're moving away from flats and going to three-dimensional things, and it's exciting, and it happens a lot in Mr. Toad's too, on the actual attraction.
Yeah.
But the facade, I mean, so much changes on the outside. Real quick, do you mind if I share the Mad Hattery?
Yeah.
Because I just think it's kind of cool. I love this picture of it because you see it all the way in the back. Again, the medieval flat style. And this is the space that they're going to kind of rob from to get and garner more for this queue space and the ride show building for the attraction. And then you can see what it looks like afterwards as it gets moved adjacent more to the left. But this Tudor style building and this English scape makes sense because we're bridging the gap from Mr. Toad to Alice in Wonderland. So like England is just extending, if you will, which I think is pretty cool and makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So
absolutely.
All right, back to you, Kate.
Okay, so I wanted to share some concept art from this new Mr. Toad from 1983, but there's like very little concept art that exists from it. I did find one. I don't know if you found any extra, Kirk, but I found one of this. So I have the colorized version, and I found it a slightly better quality black and white version of it, which is basically it's the facade of the outside with the Mad Hatter shop on the side.
Yeah, I have a different one than that.
Oh, yeah. That one, I feel like that's fan-made.
So, okay. This is fan-made because they colorized it. There is a black and white version, but it's so pixelated and horrible to scan. But this is the same image. It's just colorized so that they could sell it.
Yeah, it's the elevation of the front of the facade. Yeah. But it does look pretty much like what we have today. So that makes sense. But there just isn't that much concept art that has been released from the Imagineering library. They just haven't made it public. I'm sure that there's much more concept art for this particular 1983 remodel. I just have not run into it in any books that I have or online. It's actually shocking how little information there is about Mr. Toad's Wild Ride. I was actually joking with Kirk about this, that when I was doing research, I do a lot in books, but I also was trying to pull some things online because there's interviews and things that are out there. And I was like, almost like a quarter of the stuff I pulled up for the history of Mr. Toad was like my own content. And I was like, well, that's not helpful.
Yeah, certainly.
Let's talk a little bit about the exterior of this mansion. It's a Tudor mansion that is talked about in the book The Wind in the Willows. So within The Wind in the Willows, here's the description of Toad Hall. "Tell me about Toad Hall," said the jailer's daughter. And Toad responds with, "It's an eligible, self-contained gentleman's residence, very unique, dating in part from the 14th century, but replete with every modern convenience. Up-to-date sanitation." And he goes on, and he says he told her about the boathouse, the fish pond, the old walled kitchen garden, and about the pigsties and the stables and the pigeon house and the hen house, and about the dairy, the wash house, the china cupboards, and the linen presses. She liked that bit especially. And about the banqueting hall and the fun they had there when the other animals were gathered round the table, and Toad was at his best, singing songs, telling stories, and carrying on generally. So that, from the Wind in the Willows book, that is how they describe Toad Hall. This, of course, is from the author of Wind in the Willows, Kenneth Grahame. And it's said to have been inspired by several houses in England, which I have some pictures of. And this is not
cool.
This is not an exhaustive list, but this one is the Moat House.
Darn. I was hoping you were going to go, dude, this is an exhaustive list. And everybody listening would be like, great. Almost time we got through English Tudor mansions.
Yeah, I know. I'm sorry that this isn't just an episode about Tudor mansions. I am sorry to disappoint you.
Cool. These are very cool, Kate. I'm not gonna lie. These are dope.
Yeah. So this is the Moat House on Lichfield Street in Tamworth, and you can see the obvious, chimneys and whatnot in the structure, their whole structure that looks very much like it. And again, these are the ones that didn't necessarily influence Disney Imagineering. This is the one that influenced the book, the author of the book, Wind in the Willows. So that one is the Moat House. And then we have Maple Durham House near Reading. is from 1585. And is if I mispronounce any of this and you are an English person and you're like, that's not how you say that, I'm sorry. I'm just going to apologize now. I'm obviously.
We were swimming in the themes earlier, so.
Yeah.
Oh, that one looks much more like Toad Hall to me.
Yeah, especially with the entranceway. It has kind of this this white kind of stone entranceway, and then it has the red brick, and then the chimneys as well that look a lot like the two chimneys. And then the next one is this one is Nyman's in West Sussex. And so you can see here is where we see more of the like circular building structures that we see in the front of Mr. Toad.
I have a picture of Toad Hall from the Disney animated, if you want to jump to that real quick.
Yeah. Okay. Why don't you chat about this? And I got to go back because I have a rabbit trail we have to go down.
Okay, please. So this one's great because, again, it's really integral to the whole entire Wind of the Willows story, to how much boating becomes one of the obsessions of Mr. Toad. It doesn't really come up in the animated feature, but the river is a part of that story because, of course, some of the friends of Mr. Toad, particularly our water rat friends, lives right on the river. So you see that right here. There's a Stonescape bridge, and then in the back is that Tudor-style mansion, which does have both columns and circular structures. It almost looks like some of the top turrets are very rook-like. It kind of has those vibes of the Haunted Mansion, like the top parts of the mansion here in Walt Disney World in Orlando, Florida.
Yeah.
So it's kind of got that vibe. It's very cool. But the rest of the structure really doesn't. So
right.
Yeah, I think it looks a lot like a combination of estate number 2 and estate number 3 that you shared.
Yeah. So if we go back to mine here, you can see that's number 3. So that one is Nyman's in West Sussex. And then we have also this one, which is Maple Durham House near Reading. So yeah, I agree. It's kind of a combination of those. I mean, it's no doubt that they definitely were inspired by those ones for sure. But now I think it's really important that we go down a weird rabbit hole with Kate. So we're going to talk about this, which is priest holes. So
what? I feel like I have to start doing some sort of prayers after whatever you're going to talk about right now. This sounds grossly inappropriate, Kate.
I promise it's not. It's actually super innocent. But it sounds...
He's got his whole, like, he's got his whole garb on. Like, that's, you know what's ridiculous is that obviously this is more modern and contemporary of this dude coming out of here than what used to actually happen. But tell me about priest holes.
Let's talk priest holes. Okay. So these houses were made in the 1500s here. A lot of them we're talking really, really old houses, right? And they're still here and they're around. So because of many of these houses were so old, they were around back during the Reformation. This is, of course, when Henry VIII established the Church of England because he wanted to get a divorce, essentially, and the Catholic Church didn't allow that. So he's like, forget you. I'm going to make my own church, and I'm going to make myself the head of it. So during this time, there was a couple things that went back and forth a little bit with the Church of England and the Catholic Church in England. But eventually, under the reign of Elizabeth I, they passed the Act of Uniformity in 1559, which basically made Catholicism a crime with severe punishment. Okay. So because many still believed in the Catholic Church and that was the one true church, they had to sneak priests into the country so they could continue to, serve the Lord in England under, duress. Essentially, it is secret. So priest holes became secret hiding spots that were built into people's homes to conceal Catholic clergy during the government raids, and also stored Catholic items like candles and Bibles and crucifixes and incense and all those things. The hiding places would often be very small and came in a variety of forms, and they could be behind wall panels or high up on the attics of a house. pursuivants or priest hunters would search houses under Elizabeth I's orders, and they would compare the number of windows outside and inside, rip up floorboards, and tap on walls to detect hollow spaces. So they became like an expert guy that like built these priest holes. I thought it was interesting. I don't know.
I find this very fascinating. I need to know more. I will tell you that I had to go and look for something priest hole related, and this is all I could find.
Oh.
It is. I don't know what he's looking at, but I don't want to know.
I don't think that's the same thing. Just saying.
He's certainly clergy doing something. Oh my lord.
Anyway, thanks for going on my weird rabbit hole with me. We're going to go back to Toad Hall.
Probably, like a great hook is priest holes. Like there's no way. There's no way people wouldn't. That's the history is so crudely defined, and it's hysterical because like there's nothing like that is hysterical. Name that.
I don't know, but it's when I found it, I was like, we can't not talk about this on Distory.
Or priest hole.
Oh gosh. Okay. Back to Toad Hall. This is the same image that Kirk showed before this is from the film of The Wind in the Willows. Well, The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad is the version that Disney made, of course. We talked about that in a whole episode in itself. But the version that we know of Toad Hall isn't exactly like this version that we see from the film. Instead, we got ours from somewhere else, which is the Storybook Land Canal Boats, which we kind of briefly talked about in a previous episode. But we're going to go in a little bit more in depth here just for a moment to understand where this came from. So, Toad Hall originally was in the place where the Sultan's Palace is now, from Aladdin in the Storybook Land Canal Boat. So it's on this like little kind of like peninsula, I guess you could say. And you can see this is what it looked like when it was this tiny, tiny little version of it sitting on that peninsula. And I do have a picture of this is before they changed it to Sultan's Palace and then after. So you can kind of get a picture of where it used to live. Toad Hall actually was removed when they put in Sultan's Palace, and it didn't come back until a year later in a new location. And that was because people were so upset that it left. There was a lot of nostalgia for Toad Hall. But Tony Baxter said he went on Storybook Land Canal Boats at this point, and he heard a little girl say, like, "Look, Mama, it's Jasmine's house. Like, she lives there." And that he was like, that's why we have to update these rides and make them relevant to new generations because of those kids that like know those new stories and they want to see them in the parks. And that meant a lot to them. So, but there was kind of uproar that they removed Toad Hall. So they did move it over here a little bit later on in the ride, essentially. So Toad Hall still exists. But do you remember, Kirk, how we found like all that concept art that you discovered?
Yeah, from heritage auctions.
Yeah, and they were associating it with Mr. Toad's Wild Ride, and I think that was inaccurate because I think it's here for Storybook Land Canal Boats. And so I pull it up here. This shows Ratty's house from that auction, and then you can see where it used to live. Here is down by the water in the very front of Toad Hall. So that is Ratty's house there. And I actually have a little story about this tree that's above it that it's kind of built into. You can see it there. They said they uprooted a 100-year-old grapevine, turned it upside down, and made it appear like a terribly tortured old snag in front of Ratty's home in the Wind of the Willows. That was from the 1965 version of Walt Disney's Disneyland by Marty Sklar. So that's where that information came from, which I think was fascinating. So you can see it here. It's kind of gotten chopped down a little bit. So the vine is still there, but it's obviously kind of phasing out. And then eventually it just got rid of it altogether. And it became like a tree stump. And like a fake one that they made, and they built the house into that. And then it's like even smaller stump, and you can watch it actually like physically deteriorating here, which I think is actually pretty fascinating because then they just drained it, and this is kind of what it looked like before they removed it altogether, which is super sad actually. When they moved it, they did add something else though. They added Molly's house to it instead. And I love that they have this sign that says Toad Hall, but it says Ratty's and Molly's, but Molly's is spelled wrong. It's spelled Molley. It's only supposed to have one L. So somebody messed up painting that sign,
Huh.
which I don't think it exists now, but now I want to go investigate and see if that's still around because that's not good that they messed that up. But then you can see the concept art for Mr. Mole's house that Kirk had found. And then you can see what the little house looks like today. So not exactly like the concept art, but same general idea.
I wonder why they changed Ratty's house and just kept on making, like, I understand from going from an actual vine to some sort of ceramic, fiberglass, concrete structure, but like, why did they keep on making it to the point where they just removed it? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. So do you remember, Kirk, when you found that like water wheel, like mill, and you found the concept for that in that?
Yeah.
Okay, so that is like, I'm saying that's from Storybook Land Canal Boats. So you can kind of see it here. And then this is what I think it is actually representing. And they ended up putting this in the Alice in Wonderland section. And I do have a quote from Ken Anderson about this. And he says, "We had special problems too for Storybook Land Canal Boats. Pinocchio's village, for example, has to have a certain character. It has to fit the idea of the story. And what kind of house did Alice live in before she followed the White Rabbit down the hole into Wonderland?" And they're like, it's not in the movie. So they had to invent their own kind of house. So they took that mill and they decided, I guess that's like Alice's house and put it over there, which I think is interesting because I'm like, I never would have guessed that she would live in something like that.
Yeah. I feel like she would have, right? Because like, look, here, this is at the very end of Alice in Wonderland. And in the background, you can see a giant, it looks like, honestly, a church.
That looks like a church.
But they are on the water. So
you have a Storybook Land Canal Boats. So the church would make sense. But yeah, I guess if it's on the water, maybe they live in a mill house.
Maybe, I don't know. I feel like they're fancy people and they're in like a mansion. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like if you think of some of the language and the history that her sister is teaching her, it's very highbrow, falutin, old English. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like that's not normal societal types of things. And even their attire is not exactly impoverished or people who live in a mill.
Yeah, I know. I agree. But it's that, nevertheless, that's what they decided to put her in. Maybe because they had already worked up a mill concept and they decided, probably like the old mill. They do have the old mill section in this, but it has windmills instead. So I don't know. I don't know for sure exactly what's going on with that. So let's talk a little bit about the Tudor architecture, which was from 1485 to 1603 is kind of the rough era that we're talking about here. Tudor manor houses were usually built in brick, which was novel at the time, so it was considered the wealthy people had the brick houses, okay? It was fashionable, luxurious building technique, popular among the gentry as a sign of their wealth and social status. So maybe Alice would have had a brick house instead. She was way after that, just kidding. So, but
she is a brick house. People say let it all hang out, but
But now we have to go down another very tiny rabbit hole to chimney talk. So welcome to chimney talk.
You really went off the rails this, and I am here for it.
Yeah, that's what I said. I'm like, I'm going to talk fast with that stuff. But let's talk about chimneys for just a little bit. In this era, the use of coal became really widespread for the first time ever. So as a result, the chimneys became more common in the Tudor era, which is why we start seeing them show up all over the buildings everywhere, right? By the way, the picture we're looking at here is the Mr. Toad's Wild Ride from like 1980s when they first opened it. So it's a historic Disney photo. But anyway, with chimneys, they didn't have a lot of chimneys before this point. Previously, wood smoke would escape through a simple hole in the roof instead, but the increased smoke from burning coal necessitated a way to funnel the smoke out of the room, and hence the chimneys were born. Chimney stacks were often clustered in groups, and individual chimney columns were often twisted or checkerboard patterned, which I think you can see here. And that's just kind of a way of making them more expensive to create, so it was just a sign of your wealth. You got fancy chimneys, you're a rich person. You're in the upper echelon. You can also see here, this is kind of some more Tudor style buildings that you can see. The bricks of Mr. Toad, they did warm up the color of them a little bit from the one we saw in the movie. And that's mostly to make it fit with the rest of Fantasyland better. That's the only reason, just make it a little bit more whimsical and less cold. Anyway, so beyond chimneys, we also have weather vanes. So this one is from the...
Oh, the weather vanes are great.
Yeah, so we have this weather vane that's on with Mr. Toad and his motor car, and we have east and west, north and south, and a little arrow pointing which direction. He's flying off of the seat and looking like he's having a fantastic day. And this one is actually from Disneyland Paris. You can compare and contrast. They look almost identical because I'm pretty sure they are. So Disneyland Paris does not have a Mr. Toad ride. They do have a restaurant, though, which I got to visit with my family and eat at Toad Hall, which was pretty cool.
Yeah, courtesy of Dave Land Webb, he had a really nice one of, it's like a high def one, which is pretty nice.
Yeah, that is nice.
And you can actually see him like holding the wheel, Mr. Toad, that is. He's off the seat, though, as he's slamming on the gas, which is kind of funny. Isn't this kind of interesting, though? Like, I kind of wish, this is like a little storytelling wish of mine, is that don't you wish there weren't necessarily directions on there, because he is aimless in his pursuits? And wouldn't it be great if he was going in nowhere particular, or maybe it was like instead of NS, it was NP, just a little.
Yeah, that would be.
Do you know what I mean? That's just, as soon as I saw it, I immediately went to, well, why is there directions on it? And I needed to see each side, and it is just northeast, southwest. I wish it was nowhere in particular. That's just me.
Interesting. Well, to be fair, I don't think that weather vane turns very often. At least the arrow part does not. So,
fair.
I'm guessing it's pretty heavy, and so it probably doesn't spin very much. I have never really seen it turn. Like, it seems like it's always pointing in the same direction. But there is...
Maybe it doesn't turn.
Yeah, maybe not. But over in Disney... I'm going to pop over to my side. Over in Disneyland Paris, they also have another weather vane, which is Mr. Toad on like a... I think it's Mr. Toad. It's on a unicycle with an umbrella. So there's that, too. It's different.
Yeah, I've never seen that before.
No, me neither.
This evening, life has changed. I am a changed man.
Do you want to talk about the...
This version of Mr. Toad reminds me more of The Wind in the Willows.
Yeah, it does.
Than the Disney film.
Yeah, definitely. Which would make sense for a European park, for sure. Do you want to talk about the crest above the door?
It says Mr. Toad's Wild Ride on here, but then when we actually zoom in on the shield, it says Toady Acceleratio Semper Absurda.
Toady
Acceleratio. Sorry, my Latin is horrendous. Horrendissio.
Spent a lot of years in choir singing in Latin, so...
Okay, so what does it say?
Toady acceleratio semper absurda, so translates to Toad's acceleration is always absurd, or a speeding toad is always absurd. Either way.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think he's pretty ridiculous too. I like, you know what's funny is it shows him in two modes of travel as well, because you get him both in his car and then also with Cyril and the horse-drawn carriage.
To kind of talk about this crest a little bit, there is a kind of a knight helmet that's like a toad-shaped knight helmet with a crown on top of it. And then it does say, it has pictures of Toad both in a motor car and also in that little carriage that he was driving. But it's interesting that Disneyland Paris also has a crest above their door, which is very common of Tudor-style houses to put a crest above the doorway. So this is very on par for that architecture. But theirs for this Mr. Toad restaurant has a picture of Mr. Toad holding, like kind of like a waiter holding like a dish, covered with a little dome, and has his little towel on his arm. And then it says, no consumus frog legus, which no consumists don't eat frog legs. Yeah, exactly. So, and it's not exactly Latin. It's a little bit, fudged, but so people could understand what it means. But I think that's a cute detail myself.
Well, on ours above, once we get to the top part, you see Mr. Toad and he's holding something, but what is he holding in particular?
Up above? So he's holding a monocle up there.
Yeah,
In the back.
he's super fancy. He's like the Monopoly man.
So there you
I'm
go.
a pretty up close one too, which shows it in his left hand. You can actually see that the monocle is domed, which I think is interesting. That the glass itself.
It
So
is interesting. I don't know if I ever noticed that before.
yeah, I just thought it was like a flat pane, but it's not. It's actually domed, which is interesting decision.
Do you think they did that because they don't want it to like magnify and like burn holes and stuff? Like, I don't know how that works, but that's what I would guess, right?
Sure, sure. What do I know? I've never built a magnifying glass ever in my life. It's possible.
Oh, I wanted to show this is what the old Mr. Toad's Wild Ride looked like as well. And it did have a crest of Mr. Toad above it back in the 1955 version as well. So I love that there's kind of a tie over to that from what we have now. But I do have this picture, which was taken in the 1990s. And this is actually little Kate. So this is like 14-year-old me with Mr. Toad. And you can see him with his monocle behind. But I ran into that in my files and thought I would share. Okay, so let's now talk about a couple of other things that we see here. There's also some like leaves and embellishments on the eaves of this as well that you can see that they have Mr. Toad heads. And then there's like these little, what are they like leaves that are with it as well. And very sharp angled roofs. That's definitely something that is notable for the Tudor style as well. And then in front of the house, there is a Mr. Toad car, but I kind of want to not talk about that until we get closer to the cars on the inside, if that's okay. But just pointing out that exists up there.
Well, we have another bust. So there's on the left-hand side over that I don't know what you would call that, like more like atrium style windowing. Mm-hmm. There is a I can't read if there's anything inscribed because there is a like a plate underneath it.
Yeah.
It's men's, but there is Mr. Toad just from like the, I don't know, like chest up kind of sitting up there. But yeah, I couldn't tell. The other thing that I love is the woodworking on here. I think there is a better picture. It's a little bit more up close and you can see both. It looks like grapes on a vine. And then there's like embellishment.
Yeah. Yeah, I didn't see the grapes part. I saw the leaves, but not the grapes. Interesting.
Yeah, so leaves, and then there's grapes, and then there are it's like a gold ribboning that goes through it. But then it has these like little gold Mr. Toad heads all over on the trim work of this wood, and up that little kind of like scepter looking. What would you call it? Like not prow, but the very very top part where the two.
Yeah.
Right, angled parts of the roof meet.
At the bottom of the eave, too, there's something that's kind of like it's hanging and it looks like I think it's an artichoke in design, but I couldn't find any other like pictures of it or explanation for what it was in Tudor style architecture. I did look for a good like 20 minutes. Then I said, I can't research these artichokes anymore. I had to give up the ghost, but I feel like I have a picture of it.
Yeah, I need to see this artichoke picture now. Oh,
let me see. So you can kind of see, I think this is the Disneyland Paris version, but you can see at the bottom of the eave, there's kind of like a round object that has almost like leaves on it. And that is kind of the artichoke version. I think we'll run into it later too, as we talk about other things. But yeah, so just some extra detailed design there, which definitely indicates that Toad is a very wealthy Toad. He's well off to have all these embellishments on his house, which is the storytelling that they're trying to convey here with all these details.
That's wild looking.
Yeah.
Huh.
Cool? Yeah.
It almost looks like a pine cone, but it's a lot fatter. Interesting.
Yeah, I looked at white cones first, and then I ran into artichokes, and I was like, okay.
It's a lot. What like most pine cones are rather slender, so that's definitely more spiritual than. That's an unrobust pine artichoke you bought on that priest hole. Thanks. I adorned it myself.
We have a comment here from Magda that says artichokes symbolize hope and prosperity. So that could be something also for Mr. Toad. So thank you for adding that. Okay, before we move on, before we go forward, we have to do our little pause just to chat about some of the current projects that we are working on to share with you guys what's going on outside of Distory. So, Kirk, do you want to share what's going on over there at Walrus Carp?
Sure. We're doing signups for a theme park planning and dining app that Dean and I have been working on for the last 11 months. This works across all of the Orlando properties, including Disney, Universal, and SeaWorld. We'll add more parks as we go in Florida to start. It has a dining search functionality, but so we've had an overwhelming group of people sign up to be beta testers. So now we're moving forward with just taking people who are interested for when releases or updates or demos or when we want to showcase new features. And that can be located at mowd.io, mode.io. So yeah.
Super excited for the new app. Okay, so I have a couple of new things over here at Disney Cicerone that are pretty exciting. And one is that I made a new Substack subscription that's available. I post content on there that's basically writing, so it's writing heavy. So I know that sometimes there's a lot of delay between one book from the next, and you guys have been asking me like, we want more writing from you. So this is the place to get it. So disneycicerone.substack.com. I'm over there and I do have free stuff that I post. I also have stuff if you want to support me as a writer. I have stuff that's exclusive content that's either a preview of books to come or just chapters I'm writing just for you guys on there. So that's something new and exciting. And also this past week, I finished my next book, writing it, which is a sequel to A Glimpse of the Magic, Finding Ourselves in the Disney Story. So it'll be a nonfiction curation of writings about the Disney parks and integrating Disney history into it. And this one has a little bit of a theme towards moving forward and hope is kind of its overarching theme, but it has a lot of different kinds of writing within it. So look for that in probably another month or two. It has to go through editing. It has to do a little bit of, I have to do some book design because I design my own covers of my books. So I'm going to work on that and then we'll get it out to you guys so you can have hopefully some encouraging writing, especially since this year has felt like 3 years already and we're still in January. So it's coming.
For those that are keeping track, that's 2 nonfiction and 3 fiction stories that are all related to the Disney parks that Kate has authored, which is pretty sweet, dude. You're 50% of the way to 10. Yeah. So that's exciting. I know that was a huge goal of yours in the next, couple years. So that's pretty sick.
Yeah, thank you. All right. So let's move on. Let's talk about the exterior queue for Mr. Toad. So you can see there is a good picture here of the gate when it's closed. Just because we don't always see it closed, they usually do close it for when Fantasyland's down in the evenings. But I just thought I would give a little picture of that as well. And then you can see this like metal arbor or like pergola that has wisteria on it. Now, this is how I remember it being from like my childhood, was the wisteria was growing like all the way over it and created this beautiful shade that smelled really good. But they've cut it way back in years recent times. They've cut it way back. So you don't see it quite as much, but it's this beautiful purple wisteria, which symbolizes wisdom, endurance, and longevity. Which I don't really know if that they thought about that. I think they did it more for aesthetics because I don't think Mr. Toad's got a lot of wisdom personally. So
yeah, definitely more impulsive than thoughtful.
Yeah, I want to talk about these chains a little bit. If you don't mind going on a little chain rabbit hole with me. Told you I had little rabbit trails. So these chains are significant in the Disney parks in a very small way, but most people don't think about the chains when they're going around them. So this is a story from Rolly Crump when he was supervising art director in Disneyland. And he said, we had some beautiful white chains around the queue for the carousel and the Fantasyland lines. By the end of the day, though, those chains had been banged back and forth so much that they were all chipped. It always bothered me that the painters had to go out there every single night and repaint them. I thought it was a waste of paint and a waste of their time. So the painters asked Rolly if there was something he could do because they're like, dude, we're dying here. Like, we have to keep repainting these chains every night. Like, can you imagine your life if that's your life, is repainting chains every day?
Kind of feels like sometimes.
Yeah. So he came up with an idea. He said, why don't you see if there's any chains we can purchase that are anodized aluminum? He went out that one day to travel to some stores and see what he could come up with, and he eventually came back with a sample of these old anodized aluminum chains that were gold. I took one look at them and knew they were our solution. We bought a whole bunch and changed out those chains that night. We had so many left over that we also changed out the chains all over the rest of the park, too, such as for Pirates of the Caribbean. That saved the painters a lot of time and a lot of money. So you see these gold chains in the queue of Mr. Toad, plus all around the park.
That's very cool.
Crowley Crump. Yeah. Chain talk. Who knew?
I like that. That's awesome.
Yeah. All right, Kirk, what have you got in the queue? I know we have the planter coming up next. What do you I don't want to like
I had similar. I had the gold adorned chains as well. I didn't realize that they were anodized aluminum though. That's really cool. And I love that story. That's so fun. So you can see him wrapping all the way through there. And then of course that pergola which doesn't have wisteria growing on it, sadly again.
Yeah.
You know, it's kind of interesting that don't you think it's unique that the Matterhorn and that the way that topiary is kind of shaped are somewhat like twins?
Yeah.
Or is that purposely? Are there times? Because again, I'm not Mr. Disneyland. So are there times where that does obscure the view of the Matterhorn, and that's purposely for sightlines?
Most likely, there's actually like a tree that's over in Frontierland that actually is shaped almost like the Matterhorn because they're trying to block the Matterhorn from Frontierland because you really don't want to see it from there. So I would be surprised if that tree wasn't serving some sort of purpose of blocking a sightline to the Matterhorn from when you're down in it. But truthfully, you can see the Matterhorn from a lot of Fantasyland. So it's not doing a very efficient job if that's what they're trying to do from it. But it is a beautiful tree, though. I really love that.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about those characters first, and then I'll talk about the planter?
I mean, yeah, it has the four main characters from The Wind and the Willows, and each one gets their own little like shield or plaque. So you have J. Thaddeus Toad, it says Master of Toad Hall, an incurable adventurer. Then you have Mr. Mole, a loyal and sympathetic friend. You have McBadger that says offers sage advice, so often scorned, and he looks like he's scowling. And then, of course, you have Mr. Rat tries to cure Toad's motor mania.
Tries unsuccessfully to cure that motor mania.
Mm-hmm. Don't we all?
Yeah. So somebody asked me recently, what got me into obscure Disney history? What is it that like makes me so excited to do this? What was like the one thing? Because it is kind of these among Disney historians, there's always like this one thing that kind of like tips it over into like an obsession. And so for me, it was this planter in the queue of Mr. Toad. So you can see it here. I'm always like, what in the world is this planter about? Why does the queue go around this planter? What was that way back in the day? This was like my thought process. And I found out that the reason this planter was here was because, if you can see in this picture here, the Skyway Tower is located in the exact same plot where that planter is. So they had to build around the Skyway Tower when they built Mr. Toad and Toad Hall. And so, of course, now we've talked about the Skyway on Distory before, so the Skyway eventually goes defunct, but they still had that spot in the queue where the pilings went into the ground, so they had to build this planter around it, and they just planted some shallower plants and whatnot and a tree in the center. But there's a similar spot that's over by Casey Junior Circus Train as well. That's another planter where another tower used to be, but that was like the thing. This was like my Roman Empire, was this weird planter in the Toad queue, and I actually included it in my very first novel that I ever wrote, a little story about it because it was so important to me. So a little behind the scenes for that. I know, Kirk, you had some gardening things you want to talk about. I know we're working our way around the side of the exterior queue.
Was trying to figure out what some of the flowers are. I can only take a guess, because these kind of look a little bit like either impatiens or mums in the fronts. And I don't know if they seasonally plant things. Did you find anything about the flower beds in the front?
Yeah, they do change them out every once in a while. I do have a picture I can show of it.
Yeah, I had ones where I had yellow and orange flowering plants that were low.
So I have here, I've got red geraniums. The geraniums mean love, friendship, health, and good fortune, which makes sense for Mr. Toad with all of his friends. The leaves, I think, resemble lily pads. And I honestly think that's why they put them in here, is that they're supposed to resemble lily pads, which is part of the design of Toad Hall.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah. And then the scarlet sage is the one that kind of looks like fireworks-ish. That scarlet sage represents the heart of love, which I don't think is relevant here, but it's thought to bridge the gap between the mortal world and the divine, which is maybe a subtle foreshadowing of where we end up at the end of this ride, where he's ending up in a very hot place. And I was thinking about all the flowers here. The colors are reds, pinks, yellows, and oranges. Like that's usually what they plant here, which are all that, again, subtle foreshadowing for what's coming up at the end of this ride, right?
That makes a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm. So that's what I think is probably going on here. Unless
I never saw it. Again, I lean to you when it comes to things that like would be wallpaper to me, because I just haven't been there and I haven't stared and I haven't sat in the queue long enough.
Right.
But I am in love with the flower choice with lily pads. It's such a subtle one that probably guests maybe inherently pick up, but it's subtle. I love that.
Yeah, and they do replant this from time to time with different plants. You know, their landscaping team is always working on it. But this was fairly recently. I feel like this might have been in December because I was taking lots of pictures. So, they change it out seasonally for what is going to work. But I love that geraniums make sense for winter and for this season. So, anyway, I want to go back just a couple of feet, just a little bit back, because we walked right by this fabulous hallway here where we kind of go under this little tunnel section, and there's a really unique feature that is to the side, and it's basically where you can kind of peek in and see the cars start going around, because there's this stained glass door on the inside, and then there's these iron door on the outside that has these cattails in it, and this beautiful ironwork. And cattails, again, are another one of the design details you see kind of throughout Toad Hall in the beginning here. And this gate, they actually do open this up in the summertime when it's hot for airflow. So they open, not the gate necessarily, but they open up the doors once in a while in the summertime, which is kind of fun to see them. And then you really get to see the cars going around. And I always remember as a little kid, like peeking my head through the gate and like watching the cars go by as you're coming around in the queue. So
that's a fun anticipatory for guests.
Yeah, I think so. And then you want to talk about the sign a little bit, Kirk, about the
Sure. Yeah, we got a little toady action here. He's sitting up on framed woodwork that says, Mr. Toad's Wild Ride. Take a wild joyride in a motor car careening through the noisy nighttime streets of London to nowhere in particular. Supervise children at all times, and handicap must transfer. But yeah, I love his face. He's so excited and happy. I mean, I'm with him.
Yeah, so there's another sign that's before that. That's the wait time sign. I didn't have a picture. You got the front. So you're showing the front of Mr. Toad's Wild Ride wait time sign. But remember, in Fantasyland here, all the back sides of these signs are actually storytelling pieces for Fantasyland. So for the attraction. So, and I have one here that says, Ho, ho, sit still, and you shall know what driving really is, for you are in the hands of the famous, the skillful, the entirely fearless Mr. Toad. So,
that's fun.
Yeah, I love the storytelling that's on the back. And again, check every single ride when you're waiting in line. Make sure you read the backs of these signs, because a lot of people don't even know that they have storytelling elements on them.
This one's pretty obvious because you're going right through the hallway and it's directly in front of you. So I would imagine most people would catch this one, or maybe not others.
Yeah, but not like, I know the Alice one, people don't always catch that one because it's like they walk right by it in the queue and they don't really see it again necessarily as they go by. So
yeah, and you're only really looking at the front of it. You more see it from the caterpillar for Alice, at least.
Right. And we're approaching now Mr. Toad, and I want to just briefly mention these sconces that are on the left and right sides. These kinds of sconces made with this ironwork with like these black spikes on them. These are something that has been around since 1955 in Disneyland. However, what I don't know is if these ones were created after the ones, like in the style of the ones that used to be in 1955, or if these ones are actually repurposed from old Fantasyland. So I have this picture. If you can see on the right-hand side, you will see this kind of, it's just on the edge of the photo, you can see a very similar lamp. It's obviously not the one I just showed you because it's missing the little details of some curls on it. But you can see, remember when we did Snow White Kirk and they had these same kinds of ones they used for the crown of like the evil queen, and then they moved it to the exit, so now it's a lamp. But I think that these were all over Fantasyland in the 1950s and 60s. And so I think that they pulled that forward from the history of Fantasyland, and then they made these ones for Mr. Toad. So I love that it's kind of a nod to the Fantasyland that used to be, and not many people even realize that that is what it is.
That's very cool. I love that.
Yeah.
I have, while we're on sconces, can I take a stab at a sconce?
Yeah, go for it.
This sconce is going to be over here on the right-hand side. I don't know if there's one on the left somewhere else because the only picture I have, it's super up close, and I think it's more towards like the exit of the ride. And I know we're technically still on the outside, and it's a little bit, it's over to the right more, but I think this fits. Let me pull up a picture of it. And if you go real in close, it looks a lot like the head of a lion, body of a lion, but with wings, which would be like a griffin, like a mystical griffin, which denotes like power and prestige and strength. So I don't know whether or not that's purposeful because of, I don't know, Toad Hall, his resolve. I'm not sure, but
I feel like I've seen that. I feel like I've seen that in other historic photos. So that's Kate's homework for the week, to see if I can find that in some of my old
look them up.
Yes. So at this point, we're going to head on inside. We have a picture of the ceiling with a chandelier, and then they have kind of this vaulted ceiling with Molly, Rat, and then Mr. Toad as well. But they're just painted on. They look like they're plaster, but they're not actually plaster. They're just painted on. So before we go to the mural on the wall, we do have one of the operators panels here, which I know Kirk loves, so I threw it in here for you.
Operator's panel.
But you can also see the cattails in this little screen that they put up, basically to just keep guests from pushing buttons. Yeah, it's to protect the operator's panel from guests. But they do have this lovely little screen that's made of these cattails. And then we're going to the mural, which has some really interesting things in it that it's for how often I've stared at this mural. I don't think I noticed all of the details before.
Well, I can tell you one thing that you probably are very cognizant of is the house on the water.
Yeah. Yep. Because the Ratty's house is down there. So this starts with all the main characters with Toad in the center, which is similar to what we saw in 1955, but they're kind of in a different arrangement. And then they had Toad is standing on the back of Cyril Proudbottom, so on his horse. And then there's a nowhere in particular sign. But then if you travel around to the left-hand side, you'll see a bridge with two policemen, the Bobbies, who have gotten knocked out because Toad has run them over, essentially. And then you see Ratty's house in the pond. You see Toad flying out of the seat of his motor car, and then there's a sign to the wharf. So you can see the wharf there, and there's actually weasels around the wharf, which, do you remember when we looked at the old wharf in the ride last week? There was a little weasel on a sign.
Yeah, there's the weasel by the barrel right there on that one.
Mm-hmm.
One coming out of a window, and then another one on a little crane action or a little pulley.
Yeah, it's so interesting that they decided to throw that weasel in, I think because of the weasel that was in the 1955 version, and they're paying homage to it on this particular mural, which I think is really special, and most people probably wouldn't realize, so that's pretty neat. We do see then the dock with the tower bridge. So this is all kind of like what you're going to expect in the ride, right? And then another Bobby with a billy club with a bike against the wall, like maybe as a nod to the motorcycle in the previous version, because we don't have that kind of same scene with the motorcyclist that you run towards. I don't know.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, and there's no police officer on it, but
no, it's just like more like a bike than a motorcycle. And then we go into town and there's a slow sign. There's Toad again with his motor car. There's the law courts building, and then a jail with more policemen. But what's really interesting here, Kirk, is that a piece of storytelling that I don't think we really get in the ride, or we don't maybe aren't cognizant of, is that he's actually busting out of jail. Do you see that? He's like,
yeah, he's smashed through and on his way to the train. Like, yeah, it's the whole backside of the jail is completely gone.
like I don't think I noticed that in the ride. That's what he does. Is like we see him go to the courts, but my brain never put together that he goes to jail and like bursts out the back of jail, and then he heads straight towards the train. So
And that finishes him.
yeah, so I mean, like he's busting out of jail. So maybe that's partially why he's having a bad end.
Yeah.
But then there's a signalman also that way in the back. He's really tiny in this version, but there's a signalman back there that is holding a stop sign instead of a lamp. So if you were with us last week when we learned our signal signs from the signalman. I love that there's a little nod to him here, even if he's holding a stop sign. And then Toad heads straight towards the train with a concerned engineer. And then Toad...
He's replaced, right? He's replaced by the Bobby.
Yeah.
Later on, the Bobby... Or does the Bobby get replaced by the signalman?
I don't think there's either, but I guess we'll see when we go through the ride. We'll see what's over there.
Yeah,
I don't think there's either. But then he heads down into the hot place with the cow devils with pitchforks waiting for him down there, and that's the end of that mural. But the other thing that's interesting about this, Kirk, is it's a tapestry. It's not just a painting. Do you notice that?
Yeah, it's hanging. You can actually see the edges that are sewn, which is really cool.
And the wallpaper is lily pads that are floating in water.
But they're not just floating without movement. I thought that was an interesting structural choice because they made ripples in the water, like they're like this lily pad is on the move.
Anyway, I'm sorry I kind of took over there. Do you have anything else you want to share about the mural?
No, that was it.
Okay.
There is Mr. Winky in here though, which is kind of fun because again, he doesn't really get a large portion, but yet in the film, he's a big part of the reason why Mr. Toad eventually ends up in court and ends up in jail. So
yeah, definitely. There's just a couple more things here before we wrap up this episode. We do have to talk about just a little bit about the cars.
Major update.
Yeah, you want to talk about it?
Yeah. I don't know a lot of the specifics of the cars. However, remember they were much, much heavier and the motors were not as strong. So I know one of the big changes that they wanted to do was change them to fiberglass. So they've retired all of the heavy. Were they made out of steel?
Yeah, they were. Yes, they were 700 pounds a piece. Yeah.
Right. So they were massive. And so what they did is they created all fiberglass versions of these vehicles and enhanced the motors on them.
These cars are identical to the ones we had before, except for a couple things. They did remove the headlights altogether as a design detail, which I think is such a huge loss. And I'm actually very sad that they did that. So
I wonder why they did.
Yeah. And but they do look pretty much the same, though, as the other ones did. They're all black seats instead of multicolors like they were going to be, so they did change that as well. But the old cars, it's interesting what happened to them. So the old cars, you can see here, this is Bob Gurr. You can see him kind of trying to rescue some of them. There's a Winky and a Ratty car, and he's trying to give them some TLC after they've been clearly sitting outside for a long time, which is very sad. I think some of these cars were probably auctioned off, but some of them ended up in other places. Like you can see this one is something they bring out during Radiator Springs during Halloween time, or Halloween as they call it there, and they've actually repurposed it as a spider in front of Flo's V8 Cafe. So
yeah, I love that.
Yeah, super, super fun to see one of the classic Toad cars kind of having a second life as a spider. And then I love this because this is Tony Baxter's house, and he actually has one of the original Toad cars in his living room, has like a throw blanket over it. It's a green one. I think it's a Cyril car. And you can see as a Mr. Toad figure next to it. I went on this rabbit trail of looking at all of Tony Baxter's stuff in his house, which was crazy and amazing. If you ever get a chance to go watch it, it's great.
We live in an actual haunted mansion.
You do
it's no.
He even has like the original storyboard art for Mr. Toad hanging on his wall. His house itself is designed after Mr. Toad's mansion, Toad Hall. This is the model of his house and what his house actually looks like. And then this is the interior. So it's very much designed after Toad Hall. And it looks very cozy indeed. Has a nice little fireplace and everything that's so reminiscent of Toad Hall, which I just love. And then we do have to talk about this a little bit because this is a bay window with stained or like leaded glass. And then he has a statue, maybe a bronze statue of Indiana Jones in front of it. And this is what reminds me of Mr. Toad that is sitting in Toad Hall, which is sitting in front of a bay window with leaded glass. So
that is interesting.
Yeah. So this Mr. Toad, do you know about this hidden Mickey, Kirk?
You showed it to me when we were there, but have at it because I don't remember it specifically.
So you can see in his eyeball, there's 3 little white pieces. And so that's said to be a hidden Mickey. But I think the more interesting thing about this Mr. Toad is something that if you remember this ride from way back in the 80s and maybe early 90s, his arms were different. So that's why I took this picture here, because you can kind of see that his arms are kind of weirdly placed behind his back. And that's because they weren't like that when the ride opened in the 1980s. You can see how his arm has actually like hinged because his arm was out to the side and he was like this. He was holding his fingers out. And guests like to either stick gum there or cigarettes, which obviously is not what Imagineering had planned. It also, like, his hand was at the level that some kids would, like, run into his fingers and get hurt. So not a great situation for that. So for a number of reasons, they pivoted his arm and turned it behind his back. And so you can see that pretty easily if you just kind of peek those out.
Funny.
Yeah. So
I would have never thought, but that makes so much sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's just a fun little thing about the Mr. Toad statue there, which everybody takes a photo with when they go through the queue. It's like iconic, and I'm glad that he's still there. And just above him are some velvet curtains too, just for kind of scene setting that we're in this elaborate hall. And I do want to talk about, though, I went on a little rabbit trail for this turnstile, and I'm really excited for this one because I take a...
The trail.
Yeah.
You got to get tonight.
I had a lot of them. But this one, I have taken a picture of this every single time I've gone through this queue. And I'm like, what are these turnstiles? Because they're everywhere in Disneyland. And so these are pretty much in every single Fantasyland ride and all the classic rides. The newer ones usually count with infrared beams instead, but the old ones still do use these old turnstiles to basically count the number of guests that go through every hour, right? So these are Perret turnstiles, who was the global leader for turnstile manufacturing for the past century since 1913. So
Of course they are.
get excited, kids. We're going to talk about turnstile history. The origin...
Does deserve another. What?
So the first turnstile maker was likely... Oh, hold on. So this is Perry Turnstiles. This is from their website. You can see that they're turnstile security and access control since 1913. But the first turnstile was likely a farmer who had cattle and crops and fenced off the border between their crops and livestock with a rock wall. You'd see this is very common in England and also in Ireland and whatnot. Very, very common. But to make it easier to access the crops but keep livestock out, they created a stone stile in this wall with 2 steps up and then like a short platform and then 2 steps down. So basically the animals wouldn't go through the wall. Well, one day a farmer decided to plunge a post in the ground and mount a cross of wood on top of the post using a spike to keep the cross on the post. The cross would have rotated about the spike like a propeller on an airplane, and thus the turnstile was born because a stile... Yeah, the stile was basically that, like the stile in his wall is this entrance to the wall, but the turnstile is the thing that turns in the stile, right? So that's where the turnstile comes from. So the version we know today... Yes.
Busy.
Slim.
I wouldn't say that. I think Priest Holes was still pretty cool. So, but anyway, this is another picture of what it would look like in between the farms. But this isn't the one that we have in the Disney queue, right? Because the turnstile is kind of like on its side, right? So the version we know today was a concept that was developed by John Perret and Conrad Trunbenbach in approximately 1928. So here are them in all their glory. And they essentially they invented the turnstile that we know today, which is it on its side. You can see it in the background of this picture. Here's Walt Disney in the opening gates in 1950s in Disneyland. And you can see the Perret turnstiles here in the back with they call it, kind of looks like a milk stool on its side with 3 prongs that turns. That was what they invented in 1928, and that's what they installed in Disneyland. So here's a little bit of a better picture of it. You can see that the Perret turnstiles installed there, and just throughout history, they just kept installing them and using the parks, and they still have them today. So that is a little bit of like turnstile history. You can see the 3 prongs there in the background. So now you know where the term turnstile comes from and also who manufactures it and all of those things. So
Kate, I was really counting on you to tell us a tale about turnstiles. So thank you for not.
You're welcome. I mean, how cool is that? Like now you're going to go by and it says Perret New York on it. And it's like every time you're like, oh, well, I know.
Known that name Perret forever, but never understood. And now I do. Now I feel like I can impress my friends.
You're welcome.
Well, I need friends to start with, but they'd be pretty impressed.
I mean, you could tell me, but I already know. So I'd be like, yeah, Kirk, I told you that.
I'm going to tell somebody, I'm going to just tell somebody who doesn't care and watch them glaze over. And that will be my accomplishment for the week.
Well, I think that's a good place for us to pause before we hop into our Toad car, our motor car, and take a wild ride on Mr. Toad. So we'll get to the bookshelf, the operators panel for Kirk next week, get into Toad Hall, and a little bit probably beyond that as well. But thank you, everybody, for joining us for this episode of Distory. We hope you really enjoyed digging into some of these weird stories and rabbit trails that I took us on. I hope that wasn't too bizarre, but I loved going over the history, the architecture, and whatnot. Kirk, do you have any final thoughts here as we wrap up?
Kate loves priest holes.
I prefer Toad in the hole.
I like Toad in the hole too, to be fair.
Like anything you say after that is horrible. So that's what I'm here on.
Well, that being said, thank you everybody for being with us for Distory. We appreciate you guys as always. We hope you have a wonderful week, and we'll see you next time for more of Mr. Toad.